Welcome to Animal Encounters. Jackson here. In this episode, we're diving into moments no one expected to witness deadly animal attacks that were actually caught on camera. From a wilderness blogger who baited a grizzly bear outside a remote Montana cabin, to a hippo's devastating assault on the Zambezi, where the wild can turn deadly in seconds. It was July 18th, 2017, and a steady drizzle fell over the grounds of a city-run zoological park in São Paulo State, Brazil. The zoo maintained a small collection of big cats in aging but functional enclosures, and its veterinary unit was equipped with a CCTV system that recorded all procedures. Reinaldo Cerqueira was a 47-year-old senior big cat keeper who had worked with the zoo's lions for over 12 years. His role extended beyond daily care into direct involvement with veterinary procedures, where his familiarity with the animals made him a critical member of the medical team. He had assisted with dozens of sedation-based examinations over his career and was regarded by the veterinary staff as one of the steadiest handlers in the facility. The procedure scheduled for this morning was a routine dental examination on the zoo's oldest male lion, a 16-year-old animal weighing approximately 450 pounds. The veterinary team prepared a tranquilizer dart calibrated to the most recent recorded weight from the last immobilization several months earlier. The dart was delivered from outside the enclosure, striking the lion in the hindquarter. After nearly 15 minutes of observation, the lion remained motionless on the enclosure floor. Multiple reflex checks, including jaw tone, palpebral reflex, and corneal response, showed no reaction, reinforcing the assumption that the lion was fully sedated. The team, led by Reinaldo, entered the enclosure. The dart had not fully discharged the intended dose, leaving a shortfall in the sedative delivered to the animal's system. Compounding this, the lion's current weight exceeded the outdated record used to calculate the dosage. The result was a lion sedated to a level that mimicked full unconsciousness, but sat dangerously close to the threshold of arousal. African lions are apex predators weighing between 330 and 500 pounds, with adult males capable of sudden, partially coordinated movement, even from apparent rest when sedation is incomplete. Their bite force exceeds 650 pounds per square inch, and their retractable claws can inflict deep lacerations with a single swipe. In veterinary settings, incompletely sedated lions represent one of the most dangerous scenarios for zoo staff. The transition from apparent sedation to full alertness can occur within seconds, particularly when physical stimulation triggers an adrenaline surge, pushing the animal out of the sedation plane. Lions under light sedation often appear fully immobile until direct contact provokes a sudden defensive response. Reinaldo assisted beside the veterinarian near the lion's shoulder, stabilizing the animal while the veterinarian worked near the head. The dental examination began and continued for several minutes without indication of any problem. Then the lion's hindquarters twitched, a single, distinct, muscular contraction that rippled across the animal's flank. Reinaldo noticed the movement immediately and called out a warning. Before anyone could withdraw, the lion's eyes opened. Its body convulsed into motion, sluggish at first, the movements uncoordinated from the partial sedation, but escalating rapidly as adrenaline surged through the animal's system. The lion reacted to the closest movement. Reinaldo was directly beside its shoulder, his hand still positioned near the animal. The lion's mouth clamped onto Reinaldo's forearm with crushing force. Simultaneously, a front paw swept outward, claws extended, striking him across the chest and the side of his neck. The lacerations opened deep wounds across his upper torso. According to accounts from the veterinary staff, Reinaldo remained between the lion and the rest of the team as they scrambled toward the enclosure door. Whether this was deliberate positioning or the result of the lion's grip preventing him from moving could not be determined with certainty. Staff outside deployed a second tranquilizer dart, but the supplemental sedation required time to take effect. In the intervening seconds, the lion inflicted critical injuries to Reinaldo's neck and upper torso. The veterinary team evacuated through the enclosure door. By the time the supplemental dart took full effect and staff re-entered, Reinaldo Cerqueira was unresponsive on the enclosure floor. He was pronounced dead at the scene from severe lacerations and bite trauma to the neck. The investigation determined that the initial sedation had been incomplete due to the dart not fully discharging and an inaccurate weight estimate. The zoo suspended all sedation-based procedures pending a comprehensive protocol review. The zoo's veterinary CCTV system had recorded the incident in full. Brazilian federal prosecutors subpoenaed the footage as part of a workplace safety investigation. The victim's family subsequently petitioned under Brazilian privacy law to block public distribution, citing dignity protections for the deceased. The footage remains sealed in federal records and has never been released. It was September 19, 2014. And the late dry season had reduced the waterways of Zambia's South Luangwa Valley to sluggish brown channels flanked by exposed sand and cracked mud. The receding water had concentrated wildlife along the remaining river. A small, independently operated walking safari camp ran multi-day guided treks along the river system. Séverine Latrouche, a 39-year-old French freelance wildlife photographer based in Lyon, had arrived at the camp as part of a 7-day walking safari expedition. She had traveled extensively across East and Southern Africa and carried a professional reputation for pursuing close-range shots. Camp staff would later note she had questioned the group's pace on the first day, preferring to move independently. "I find it interesting how experience can sometimes work against you. When you've been close to dangerous animals before and walked away fine, it rewires your sense of what's risky. You start trusting yourself more than the rules." The group of 6 guests was led by Chimwemwe Nkoma, a 42-year-old Zambian guide armed with a heavy-caliber rifle and carrying over 15 years of river experience on foot. He emphasized before each walk that guests must remain within visual contact of the guides and that approaching the river's edge was strictly prohibited. On the 3rd morning, the group paused on an elevated bank overlooking a river bend. A large colony of carmine bee-eaters had established nesting burrows in the exposed bank below. Latrouche moved away while the guides were occupied, descending toward the colony with her camera. She approached within a few feet of the water's edge. A tourist filming the colony from the group's rest position captured the initial seconds. Though the footage becomes unstable as the situation unfolds, the attack itself is partially obscured. Nile crocodiles are among the deadliest reptiles on Earth, responsible for more human fatalities than any other large predator in Africa. Mature males commonly exceed 15 feet and weigh over 1,500 pounds. Their attack relies on explosive acceleration from concealment, powerful jaws clamping onto a victim before dragging them into deeper water to drown. Bite force is estimated to exceed 3,000 pounds per square inch. Once a crocodile initiates its death roll, escape is virtually impossible. The crocodile struck from just below the surface at an angle. Massive jaws clamped around her lower leg, pulling her off her feet instantly. Nkoma scrambled down the bank and fired. The shot struck, but failed to interrupt the crocodile's momentum. Latrouche was pulled toward deeper water within seconds. Violent churning was visible at the surface as the crocodile initiated a death roll. The disturbance moved toward the center of the channel before the water settled to stillness. What gets me about crocodile attacks is the silence afterward. One moment there's chaos, splashing, screaming, and then the water just goes flat, like nothing happened. That stillness is the part I can't shake. Wildlife authorities recovered remains downstream after an extended search effort. The investigation confirmed Latrouche had left the group area without guide knowledge and approached the water in violation of safety protocols. No negligence was found on the part of Nkoma or the operator. The partial footage was seized as part of the investigation and has never been officially released. Looking at this case, the most dangerous moment on any walking safari isn't when you see the threat. It's when you forget it's there, right beneath the surface, waiting for you to take one step too many. It was August 19th, 2017, and peak summer had turned Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula into a theater of abundance. As salmon choked the rivers and brown bears gathered in extraordinary densities along every tributary, feeding with single-minded intensity to build fat reserves for winter. A documentary film crew was working in a remote river valley, filming this annual spectacle for a European broadcast series. Dmitry Volkov, a 35-year-old wildlife cinematographer from Moscow, was part of the 4-person team. The crew had been in the region for 8 days, operating under permits issued by local wildlife authorities and accompanied by an experienced guide familiar with bear behavior. The guide, a former park ranger from a nearby nature reserve, had spent over a decade working in Kamchatka's bear country and had managed dozens of close encounters without incident. He carried a flare gun and bear spray, but no firearm. Russian permit conditions for the area prohibited lethal weapons outside of licensed hunting operations. The Kamchatka Peninsula supports one of the world's densest brown bear populations, with an estimated 16,000 animals across the region. August represents peak feeding activity as bears consume salmon to build fat reserves before denning. The crew's filming location was a tributary, roughly 40 miles from the nearest road access, requiring helicopter transport. The valley floor was lush with vegetation fed by summer rains, and the sound of the river masked most ambient noise. On the morning of August 19th, the team identified a female bear with 2 cubs fishing along a shallow section of the river, approximately 200 yards from their base camp. The guide established a filming position on elevated ground that provided clear sightlines while maintaining safe distance. He reminded the crew that this particular stretch of river was used heavily by sows with cubs during the salmon run, and that their elevated position was chosen deliberately to avoid triggering maternal aggression. Dmitry operated the primary camera, a professional cinema unit mounted on a tripod with a telephoto lens. The other crew members managed sound equipment and a secondary camera. Filming proceeded without incident through the late morning. Dmitry noticed that the angle of light had shifted in a way that created better contrast for capturing the bear's movements. He mentioned to the guide that he wanted to reposition to a spot roughly 80 yards to the west, where a rock outcropping would provide both elevation and improved lighting. The guide advised against splitting the group, but did not physically prevent Dmitry from moving. He told Dmitry to make noise as he walked and to turn back immediately if visibility dropped. Dmitry acknowledged the advice, picked up a handheld camera, and walked toward the outcropping alone. The terrain between the main filming position and the outcropping included dense willow shrubs that reduced visibility to less than 15 feet in some areas. The river noise covered his footsteps, but also masked any sound the bears might have made as they moved. Dmitry maintained focus on reaching the destination, rather than continuously monitoring for wildlife. What he could not see was that the female bear had moved upstream with her cubs and was now fishing in a section of river that placed Dmitry's path directly between her and the cubs' position. Brown bears in Kamchatka can weigh up to 1,400 pounds, with females typically ranging between 400 and 700 pounds. Maternal aggression in defense of cubs is the leading cause of bear attacks in the region. Female bears will charge perceived threats at close range without warning and often make multiple attacks to ensure the threat is neutralized. Their size and power make even a single strike capable of causing catastrophic injury. Dmitry emerged from the willow shrubs roughly 45 yards from the female bear and about 30 yards from her cubs. The bear saw him immediately and charged without vocalization or warning posture. Dmitry turned to run back toward the crew's position, but tripped on uneven ground after a few steps. The bear reached him in seconds. The guide, watching from the elevated position, shouted a warning but had no way to intervene across the distance. The secondary camera operator kept filming. The bear struck Dmitry with both front paws, pinning him to the ground, then bit his head and upper back. She released briefly, circled him, and attacked again, biting at his legs and torso. The assault lasted roughly 30 seconds before the bear returned to her cubs and began herding them downstream, away from the area. The guide and 2 crew members ran toward Dmitry, while the 4th remained at the base position to radio for helicopter evacuation. They reached him within minutes and found him unresponsive with severe trauma to multiple body regions. The helicopter arrived roughly 2 hours later, but paramedics confirmed death at the scene. Russian authorities reviewed the footage captured by the crew and determined that Dmitri's decision to separate from the group and move through terrain with limited visibility led directly to the encounter. The female bear's behavior was classified as defensive maternal aggression. No action was taken against the animal. It was September 27, 2015. Piney Woods, East Texas. Dense pine and hardwood forest cut through by creek beds, logging roads, and hiking trails that see decent foot traffic in the fall. The air that time of year sits around the high 70s degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and the leaf litter on the forest floor is thick enough to muffle your footsteps, thick enough to hide almost anything resting at ground level. There were trail markers at the trailhead warning about timber rattlesnakes in the area. Aldous Gren walked right past them. Aldous was 34, a construction site supervisor from Dallas, who spent most weekends outdoors. He hiked regularly, camped often, and considered himself experienced in the field. Not in any formal sense, just in the way that years of weekend trips build a kind of confidence that isn't always backed by actual knowledge. He'd run into snakes on trails before and nothing had ever happened. He'd even picked a few up, garter snakes, rat snakes, once what he thought was a king snake. Always fine. And I think that's exactly the kind of track record that gets people killed, because at some point it stops feeling like luck and starts feeling like skill. Here's what you need to know about timber rattlesnakes, because they are not what most people expect. Adults average 3.5 to 5 feet and can weigh up to 4 pounds. Their venom is a complex mix, primarily hemotoxic in East Texas populations, which means tissue destruction, disruption of the blood's clotting ability, and serious systemic stress on the organs. They're generally not aggressive. They'll avoid a confrontation if they can, but they are extremely well camouflaged in leaf litter, and when they're cornered or handled, they strike fast and accurately. The other thing worth knowing is that timber rattlesnakes and eastern hognose snakes share the same habitat in East Texas and can look similar enough to fool someone who doesn't know what they're looking at, which matters here. Aldous was about 2 miles from the trailhead when he spotted a snake coiled partially under a pile of leaves at the edge of the path. Thick-bodied, patterned in brown and gray, completely still. He crouched down and looked at it. He decided it was an eastern hognose, a non-venomous species known for dramatic bluffing behavior, but completely harmless. He reached for it, and I genuinely want to know what was going through his head in that moment, because the signs were there. The body shape, the heavy build, the way it was sitting completely still instead of moving off. A hognose in that situation typically flattens its neck, rolls over, plays dead. This one did none of that, but he reached for it anyway. The snake struck the second his hand came within range. Single bite, back of the right hand, between the thumb and index finger. He dropped it and stepped back. That's when he heard it. The rattle, which had been tucked underneath the coils the whole time. He stood there for a moment just looking at his hand, then started walking back towards the trailhead. He made it back in about 35 minutes. By then his hand had already swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the swelling was visibly climbing up his forearm. 2 other hikers at the trailhead drove him to the nearest medical facility, roughly 40 minutes away. By the time he got there, the swelling had reached his elbow, and he was reporting chest tightness and difficulty breathing. He was admitted and treated with antivenom, but the volume of venom delivered, a full strike from a large adult, had already triggered a systemic reaction that treatment alone couldn't fully reverse. Over the next 18 hours, his condition kept deteriorating. His kidneys began to fail. Then his blood lost its ability to clot properly, triggering simultaneous clotting and bleeding throughout his body, a condition called disseminated intravascular coagulation. He was moved to intensive care. He died approximately 22 hours after the bite. Cause of death was multi-organ failure from a full envenomation. The systemic damage had already progressed too far by the time he reached medical care. A trail camera captured his departure time. 2 hikers corroborated the account, and his phone had photos from earlier in the hike, but nothing of the snake. The bite location on the back of his right hand was consistent with reaching toward a coiled animal. The death was ruled accidental.
It was the 11th of November 2013 in South Africa's Limpopo province, where dry season heat pressed flat across the Lowveld and dust hung above every trail. A semi-private wildlife reserve in the region still offered mounted elephant experiences at the time, though the practice had already attracted criticism from wildlife welfare organizations. Guides operated under strict behavioral protocols designed to keep both animals and guests stable throughout. Celeste Marrow, 26, was a luxury travel content creator whose platform centered on high-end safari experiences and curated wildlife moments. Her management team had recently pushed toward more dramatic footage in response to flagging engagement. The mounted elephant experience was intended as the centerpiece of the visit. Before the ride began, guides gave clear and repeated instructions. Stay calm, avoid sudden movements, and refrain from loud behavior near the animal. These were the behavioral baseline required to keep a large, stress-sensitive animal stable enough to carry a rider. As filming continued, Celeste grew frustrated by the elephant's pace. Despite repeated guidance from the handler, she began making sharp, loud vocalizations near the animal's head and applied repeated heel pressure against its shoulder to force faster movement, the guide told her, multiple times. And what makes this particular story difficult to process is that it wasn't ignorance. The warning was right there. It was just treated as something that applied to her. The handler halted the ride and began attempting to stabilize the animal. What is essential to understand here is the behavioral threshold of an African bush elephant under stress. An adult female weighs between 6,000 and 9,000 pounds and can accelerate to over 25 miles per hour with very little warning. The physical stress indicators are specific and measurable. Ear spreading, stiff posture, elevated tail carriage, and low-frequency rumbling vocalizations. These signal that the animal has reached a threshold. An elephant exhibiting all four simultaneously while continuing to receive aversive stimuli from a rider is not a situation any handler on foot can resolve through verbal intervention alone. At nearly the same moment, a nearby tourist accidentally dropped a heavy camera rig onto rocks a short distance away. The impact produced a sharp, metallic sound. The already agitated elephant reacted immediately, bolting sideways off the trail. Celeste lost balance and fell directly into the animal's path. Handlers attempted repeated intervention before the situation escalated beyond their control. She was trampled. Filming had been ongoing throughout the session. That footage was reviewed in full by investigators during the formal inquiry. At the request of Celeste's family, it was not released publicly and was withheld from all media coverage. Investigators concluded the outcome resulted from cumulative stress escalation rather than unprovoked aggression. The reserve suspended mounted elephant experiences following an independent review. Investigators concluded the handler had followed established safety procedures throughout. The case drew limited media attention at the time, partly because mounted elephant tourism in semi-private reserves was still widely accepted in parts of southern Africa in 2013, and partly because the investigation focused narrowly on the circumstances rather than the broader practice. In the years that followed, the reserve's decision to suspend mounted experiences was consistent with a wider industry shift driven by welfare concerns and a growing body of research on stress responses in working elephants. Whether that shift would have occurred as quickly without incidents like this one is difficult to say. What I can say is that the behavioral indicators described in the investigation report appear in virtually every serious piece of elephant welfare literature published in the decades since. The warning signs were not obscure. They were well documented. They just weren't being treated as a reason to stop. Celeste Marrow died from injuries sustained at the scene. She was 26 years old. The animal did not malfunction. It responded exactly as the behavioral indicators predicted. The handler read those signs correctly in real time and still couldn't override a decision that wasn't his to make. That's the part that's hardest to sit with.
It was September 14th, 2016, and the landscape of central Kenya stretched brown and still under a cloudless sky. A mid-sized wildlife rehabilitation center operated along a shallow river valley, housing 9 elephants rescued from failed private reserves and human-wildlife conflict situations. Odhiambo Karithi was a 58-year-old head elephant keeper who had worked with the center's animals for over 15 years, including daily hands-on care conducted within arm's reach of the elephants. The center still used free contact management, a legacy practice that allowed keepers to work in the same space as the animals without barriers. His confidence in his ability to read the animals, particularly the oldest male, was absolute. The male in question was a 40-year-old elephant rescued from a collapsed private reserve over a decade earlier. He was the largest animal at the center, standing over 10 feet at the shoulder, with thick, deeply scarred tusks that spoke to years of conflict before his rescue. He had been manageable under free contact handling for years, responding to vocal commands and tolerating the physical proximity of keepers. But over the previous week, staff had observed subtle changes. Temporal gland secretions appeared as faint, dark streaks below the elephant's eyes. His behavior during handling had turned occasionally irritable, and a slight increase in urine dribbling had been noted. These were early signs of must, a hormonal state that could transform even the most docile male elephant into an unpredictably aggressive animal. Odhiambo, who had managed the elephant through previous must cycles, assessed the signs as preliminary and not yet requiring isolation or increased distance. He continued the morning washdown routine, entering the enclosure with a hose and brush. Wekesa Njau, a 27-year-old junior keeper and Odhiambo's trainee for the past 2 years, observed from behind the enclosure barrier. African elephants are the largest land animals, with adult males weighing between 10,000 and 13,000 pounds and standing up to 12 feet at the shoulder. Males periodically enter must, a hormonal state in which testosterone levels can rise 20 to 60 times normal levels, producing extreme aggression even in animals with decades of human contact. Physical signs of must include temporal gland secretions, strong odor, and continuous urine dribbling. Early must is often misjudged by keepers because behavioral changes can escalate unpredictably. A single head strike from an animal of this size can throw a person several feet, and the crushing force of a single footstep is easily sufficient to collapse a human rib cage. The washdown proceeded normally for several minutes. Odhiambo worked along the elephant's left flank, running the brush across the animal's shoulder while the hose sprayed water over its back. Then the elephant's behavior shifted. The animal became rigid, its enormous ears flaring wide. Its trunk rose and curled. Odhiambo recognized the change immediately and began backing toward the enclosure gate, moving slowly to avoid triggering a charge. The elephant closed the distance in only a few strides. The massive animal slammed its head and tusks forward, driving Odhiambo against the pipe barrier separating the enclosure from the service area. The pressure was immense and immediate. The elephant stepped back, and Odhiambo collapsed to the ground. Before he could move, the animal brought a front foot down on his torso with its full weight. Wekesa triggered the emergency alert and attempted to redirect the elephant using vocal commands the animal had responded to throughout its years at the center. The elephant did not respond. Its attention remained fixed on the figure beneath its feet. Staff arrived with a vehicle and noise deterrents, eventually driving the agitated animal to the far side of the enclosure. Emergency medical transport was called immediately, but the center's rural location meant a significant delay before paramedics arrived. Odhiambo Karithi was pronounced dead at the scene from unsurvivable crushing injuries to the chest and torso. The investigation by Kenyan wildlife authorities determined that the keeper had continued free contact handling despite early signs of must, and that the facility lacked a written protocol for must stage assessment and mandatory distance escalation. A visiting international researcher had been filming the elephants from an adjacent observation platform when the incident occurred. Kenyan wildlife authorities confiscated the footage as part of their investigation. The footage remains sealed as government evidence and has never been publicly released. It was October 11th, 2013, and the morning air carried a sharp chill across the rocky valleys of a private desert conservancy in Namibia's Kunene region. The conservancy was home to a small population of desert-adapted black rhinos, among the rarest large mammals on Earth. It offered guided walking rhino tracking safaris, small groups led on foot through rugged terrain, to observe rhinos at a distance. Torbjørn Vikeland, a 47-year-old marine engineer from Tromsø, Norway, had arrived as part of a broader Southern African safari itinerary. An experienced outdoorsman comfortable on rough ground, this was his first African safari. The walking safari group of 3 guests was led by Isak Garoeb, a 41-year-old Namibian guide with over a decade of experience tracking black rhinos through the Kunene's rocky riverbeds. A second tracker accompanied the group as standard protocol. Garoeb briefed the group that black rhinos were unpredictable and that if the animal displayed agitation, everyone must move behind rock cover immediately. The trackers located fresh spoor in a dry riverbed approximately 2 hours in. 40 minutes later, the group spotted a solitary black rhino at a cautious but acceptable distance of roughly 80 to 100 yards. Garoeb positioned the group behind a cluster of boulders. Another guest had been recording the sighting on a handheld camera from behind the rocks. Only the moments before the charge were captured clearly. Once the rhino turned, the camera was dropped as the guests scrambled for cover. There's something deceptive about those quiet observation moments on a walking safari. Everything feels calm and controlled. The animal is just standing there, and you almost forget that it could close that distance before you finish a single breath. Black rhinos are among the most aggressive large mammals in Africa, weighing between 1,800 and 3,000 pounds and capable of reaching high speeds despite their massive bulk. Their eyesight is poor, but their senses of smell and hearing are acute. Black rhinos charge directly and with commitment, lowering their heads to bring their anterior horn into devastating contact. The impact is sufficient to knock an adult off their feet with bone-breaking force. The wind had been carrying the group's scent away from the rhino. Without warning, the breeze shifted. The rhino's head snapped upward, nostrils flaring. It wheeled toward the group and charged. Garoeb shouted for everyone to scatter behind the rocks. 2 guests and the second tracker dove behind the boulders immediately. Vikeland froze for a critical moment before turning and running in the open, away from cover rather than toward it. That freeze is what haunts me. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't defiance. His body just chose the wrong option in the 1 second that mattered, and there was no way to undo it. The rhino closed the distance at high speed. Vikeland was struck from behind, the horn impacting his lower back and knocking him violently forward. The rhino ran over him without stopping, its massive weight driving across his body before disappearing into the scrub. The entire attack lasted seconds. Garoeb reached Vikeland within a minute. He was unresponsive with no signs of life. He was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest medical facility. The investigation concluded the sudden wind shift gave no time to react, and that Garoeb's instructions had been correct. The incident was ruled unavoidable. The Conservancy revised minimum tracking distances. The recovered camera footage was turned over to the victim's family as part of the repatriation process. The family has never authorized its release, and the Conservancy has respected their wishes. This is the hardest story to sit with because nobody did anything wrong. The guide was experienced, the distance was acceptable, the protocol was followed, the wind just changed direction, and that was enough to end a man's life. Sometimes nature doesn't need a mistake to be lethal. It was September 12th, 2015. And early autumn had turned a remote national park in southern Alaska into a feeding frenzy as thousands of sockeye salmon crowded the shallows of a nearby river and brown bears converged from across the region to gorge before winter set in. For Melina Korshaw, a 29-year-old freelance nature photographer from Portland, this was the trip that was supposed to change everything. She had spent 2 years building a portfolio focused on North American megafauna and hoped footage from the area, one of the most famous bear viewing locations in the world, would help her secure representation with a stock photography agency. The trip had cost nearly $4,000 in permits, float plane charters, and lodging, money she couldn't afford to spend on images that looked like everyone else's. Melina arrived at the park's base camp via float plane that morning. stepping onto the gravel beach with 2 camera bags and a tripod case. Weather conditions were clear with temperatures near 52 degrees. The river was crowded with bears fishing at the falls, where salmon gathered in high concentrations while attempting to leap upstream. From the elevated viewing platforms, she could count more than a dozen bears working the water at once. An extraordinary concentration of predators in a space smaller than a football field. Park regulations required visitors to maintain a minimum distance of 50 yards from bears, and rangers stationed at the platforms actively enforced these rules. The platforms were packed with photographers shoulder to shoulder, many using telephoto lenses that produced nearly identical compositions. By early afternoon, Melina had captured several hours of footage from the designated platforms. According to other visitors interviewed later, she expressed frustration that the distance restrictions prevented her from getting shots that would stand out in an oversaturated market. She left the main viewing area and walked downstream along the river's edge, where the terrain became less managed and visibility more obstructed by vegetation. The sound of the falls faded behind her as she moved further from the platforms and the rangers who monitored them. A ranger would later report seeing Melina roughly 80 yards from the platform, filming with a handheld camera while slowly moving closer to a female bear and 2 cubs fishing near the far bank. The sow was a large adult, her coat dark and slicked from the river. The 2 cubs, likely born that spring, stayed close to her flanks as she waded through shallow water. The ranger began walking toward Melina to issue a warning. Before he closed half the distance, the situation changed rapidly. Brown bears, also called grizzlies, are among North America's largest land predators, with adult females weighing between 300 and 500 pounds. Females with cubs are extremely protective and perceive threats within a much larger radius than solitary bears. They can accelerate from a standstill to 35 miles per hour in seconds. Their claws, measuring up to 4 inches long, are adapted for digging, but function effectively as weapons during defensive attacks. The sow noticed Melina when the distance between them had closed to roughly 35 yards. The bear's head snapped up from the water, locking onto the figure on the bank. For a fraction of a second, everything was still. Then the bear charged across the river, water spraying from her legs as she closed the gap. Melina dropped the camera and ran toward the tree line. The bear covered the distance in seconds. The camera captured the bear striking Melina from behind with enough force to throw her forward onto the rocky ground. The bear bit her shoulder and shook violently, then released and struck her with both front paws. Melina attempted to curl into a fetal position. The bear continued the attack, focusing on her head and upper back for roughly 45 seconds. The ranger, still some 60 yards away, radioed for assistance and began moving toward the scene, deploying his air horn as he closed the distance. He was far beyond pepper spray range. The bear stopped attacking when Melina ceased moving. It stood over her body briefly before returning to the river where its cubs had remained. The ranger reached Melina within minutes and immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation. A helicopter arrived from a nearby airfield roughly half an hour later, but paramedics determined she had died before arrival. The autopsy identified catastrophic injuries to the skull and cervical spine as the cause of death. Investigators recovered Melina's camera a short distance from her body. Park officials used the footage during their review and determined that Melina had violated distance regulations and approached a sow with cubs, the highest risk scenario for bear attacks in the region. It was August 3rd, 2016. Memphis, Tennessee, a mid-sized residential complex, second floor, unit that looked exactly like every other unit in the building. No reason to look twice at it from the outside. Same door, same hallway, same everything. But if you had actually gotten inside, you would have known something was off pretty quickly. Modified enclosures in the corners, heat lamps, locked cabinets, the faint smell of rodents underneath everything. Lysel Hadwin had been keeping snakes in that apartment for nearly 4 years, and nobody in that building had any real idea what was in there. Liesel was 31, a freelance graphic designer who worked from home. No formal background in herpetology, No training, no certifications. What she had was an obsession that had been building since her early 20s, started with corn snakes and ball pythons, the kind of entry-level stuff that's pretty common in the hobby, and just kept escalating from there. By 2016, she was keeping 7 snakes total, and at least 2 of them required permits she didn't have. One of those 2 was a black mamba she had sourced through an underground exotic animal network about 8 months before this. She handled it regularly, and somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that the animal had gotten used to her, that months of daily interaction had built something close to trust, which, if you know anything about black mambas, tells you a lot about where this is going. Because here's the thing about black mambas that I think a lot of people get wrong. These are not animals that domesticate. They don't warm up to you the way a ball python might after months of handling. What Lisel was reading as calm was really just tolerance under very specific, controlled conditions. And that tolerance has a margin, a very narrow one. So, what happens when something pushes outside of it? Black mambas are among the fastest and most venomous snakes in the world. Adults reach 8 to 10 feet and are capable of short bursts of movement up to 12 miles per hour. Their venom is predominantly neurotoxic. It disrupts the signals between nerves and muscles, causing progressive paralysis that eventually reaches the diaphragm and stops breathing altogether. Without antivenom, a full envenomation can be fatal in as little as 20 minutes, and they don't need to be dramatically threatened to strike. Sudden movement, an unfamiliar scent, being accidentally contacted while resting. That's genuinely enough. On the night of August 3rd, Lisel had let the mamba move freely in her bedroom. Neighbors who knew her said this wasn't unusual. She'd mentioned doing it before, treated it like a normal part of her routine. She'd worked late that evening, eaten, gone to bed. At some point during the night, the snake was resting near the foot of the bed. Based on the physical evidence recovered from the scene, the most likely trigger was Lisel shifting in her sleep and making contact with the snake's body. That's it. That's genuinely all it probably took. The snake struck once, left side of her neck, just below the jaw, 2 small puncture marks, minimal bruising around the site. She almost certainly woke at the moment of the strike. The position her body was found in suggested she had sat up and moved toward the edge of the bed. She didn't make it off the mattress. A bite to the neck at that location would have delivered venom directly into highly vascularized tissue, potentially accelerating systemic absorption. Within minutes, voluntary muscle control begins to fail. Breathing becomes impossible. Her phone was on the nightstand, within arm's reach. It had not been touched. She was found the following afternoon by a neighbor who had noticed her front door left slightly ajar and hadn't seen her all day. The mamba was located coiled behind the dresser. Animal control was contacted before anyone entered the unit. The post-mortem confirmed cause of death as neurotoxic envenomation, consistent with a black mamba bite. Examiners estimated she lost consciousness within 10 to 20 minutes of the bite and died within an hour. The bite mark was small enough that the neighbor who found her didn't notice it at first. 7 snakes were recovered from the apartment in total. 2 were confirmed to require permits that Lisel did not hold, including the mamba, which was transferred to a licensed reptile facility out of state. The remaining 5 were surrendered to an exotic animal rescue. The death was ruled accidental. Contributing factors included the unpermitted possession of a highly venomous species and the practice of allowing the animal unsupervised access to her sleeping area. The case was closed without further legal proceedings.
It was the 3rd of August 2014 in the tropical savanna bushland of the northeastern Northern Territory, where the dry season had left the scrub brittle and the ground cracked hard underfoot. Rocky outcrops broke the flat terrain at intervals, and fallen dry brush collected in dense, concealing mats beneath the low vegetation. It was the kind of landscape that looked emptier than it was. Declan Voss was a 26-year-old survival challenge content creator whose brand was built entirely around rejecting modern safety tools. His videos framed personal locator beacons, GPS devices, and emergency communication equipment as symbols of cultural dependency. His audience rewarded the performance of total self-sufficiency, and Declan had come to treat the absence of safety gear not as a risk but as a content philosophy. For his largest project yet, Declan entered isolated bushland in the northeastern Northern Territory, planning to survive alone for 7 days while filming himself. Local guides advised him to carry at minimum a personal locator beacon and a basic medical kit. He declined both, along with a radio and emergency flares, on the grounds that safety equipment compromised authenticity. "I'll be direct. Entering the remote Australian bushland without emergency communication equipment is not a philosophy. It is a documented risk factor that appears consistently in the case files of people who did not come back. There is a point where a philosophy stops being a challenge and starts being a trap you've built for yourself." 3 days in, Declan reached beneath dry brush near a rocky outcrop while collecting firewood. A coastal taipan concealed beneath the vegetation struck his lower leg before retreating into the grass. The coastal taipan is considered one of the most medically dangerous snakes in Australia. Its venom contains a presynaptic neurotoxin called taipoxin that attacks the nervous system, depleting the neuromuscular junctions required for voluntary muscle control. Taipan envenomation can initially appear mild before systemic effects begin within 1 to 3 hours. Without antivenom administered in a clinical setting, death from respiratory failure or cardiovascular collapse is the consistent outcome. The correct first aid response is pressure immobilization firm, continuous bandaging from the bite site up the affected limb with the patient fully immobilized. Continued physical exertion accelerates systemic venom distribution. Declan attempted to treat the bite using improvised methods from online research, then continued hiking toward his extraction point. That decision, not the bite, is where the outcome was determined. He had been envenomated by one of the most dangerous snakes on Earth, in remote bushland with no way to call for help, and he kept walking. Over the following hours, initial symptoms took hold: nausea, vomiting, and early muscle weakness. Declan continued moving. By the following morning, the deterioration had accelerated significantly. Escalating muscle weakness, deepening confusion, and labored breathing had set in. Severely disoriented, he had deviated far from his planned route by the time search operations were initiated. When he failed to return at his scheduled extraction time, his sister contacted local authorities. Search helicopters were deployed. He was located unresponsive roughly 2 days after the bite, several miles from his intended route. Declan Voss was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was documented as acute neurotoxic envenomation, complicated by continued exertion and the complete absence of emergency communication equipment. His camera was recovered during the search operation, and footage was reviewed by investigators as part of the case file. At the explicit request of his family, it was never publicly released. In the months following Declan's death, several Australian wilderness and emergency response organizations issued public statements specifically addressing the survival content genre and the risks associated with entering remote terrain without communication equipment. The statements weren't aimed at outdoor recreation broadly. They were aimed at a specific content model that framed safety gear as a compromise rather than a baseline. Declan's case was referenced directly in at least one of those statements. That doesn't happen often. When it does, it's worth paying attention to, because it means the people who had to search for him across miles of remote bushland over 2 days felt strongly enough about what they saw to say something publicly. Rescue officials stated publicly that a functioning personal locator beacon would have allowed responders to reach him within hours, well within the window where antivenom could have changed the outcome. There was no ambiguity about what caused the delay. There was simply no equipment to find him.
It was January 15th, 2013, and the heavy tropical air of eastern Java hung over a privately operated reptile park on the outskirts of a coastal city. The facility catered to domestic tourists and small international groups, and its main attraction was a dominant male saltwater crocodile measuring over 15 feet in length. Bagaskoro Wicaksono was a 44-year-old headkeeper and primary show performer. He had conducted the demonstration hundreds of times over the previous 6 years, developing a routine that balanced showmanship with the practical mechanics of feeding a 1,200-pound predator. He knew the crocodile's rhythms, how long it would rest between lunges, where it preferred to surface, and how close it would come to the platform edge. His confidence around the animal was a product of repetition, and that confidence had made him the park's most reliable draw. The afternoon demonstration drew approximately 40 tourists and local visitors, many of them families with children pressed against the viewing rails above the enclosure. Bagaskoro worked from a raised concrete platform extending over the enclosure pool, elevated roughly 4 feet above the water's surface. A single low metal bar ran along the pool-facing edge, designed more as a visual boundary than a functional safety barrier. The platform surface, routinely splashed during demonstrations and coated with residue from fish and raw meat, had become dangerously slick. No non-slip matting or textured coating had ever been applied to the concrete. Bagaskoro used a long pole to dangle chunks of chicken above the water, provoking the lunging strikes that audiences came to see. The 15-foot male responded with characteristic aggression, its massive body surging upward to snatch at the suspended food. Each lunge sent water cascading onto the platform, further coating the already slippery concrete. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with dominant males commonly exceeding 15 feet in length and weights surpassing 1,200 pounds. They possess the strongest bite force of any living animal, exceeding 3,500 pounds per square inch in large individuals. During active feeding, saltwater crocodiles enter a heightened predatory state in which any movement near the water's surface triggers an immediate strike response. Their attack sequence involves an explosive lunge, a clamping bite designed to secure the prey, and a death roll, a violent spinning maneuver that disorients the victim and can tear limbs or tissue as the animal spins. Once a saltwater crocodile has locked its jaws onto a target, the grip is nearly impossible to break without mechanical intervention. Midway through the demonstration, Bagaskoro stepped back to reposition for a different feeding angle. His right foot landed on a section slick with water and fish residue. His footing gave way instantly. He fell sideways, his upper body pitching toward the pool side of the platform. His hip struck the low metal railing, and his momentum carried his torso over the bar. His right arm dropped within inches of the water's surface. The crocodile had been tracking movement on the platform throughout the demonstration, its predatory responses primed by repeated presentations of food at the water's edge. The sudden appearance of a limb within striking distance triggered an instantaneous response. The crocodile's jaws erupted from the water, clamping onto Bagaskoro's right arm just below the shoulder. The immense bite force crushed through tissue and bone. The crocodile wrenched him sideways over the railing and into the pool before dragging him beneath the surface. The animal immediately initiated a death roll, its massive body spinning violently while maintaining its grip. The rotation pulled him under repeatedly, churning the pool into a froth of brown water and foam. Staff rushed to the platform edge with long hook poles and catch poles, striking at the crocodile and attempting to force a release. Audience members later described repeated attempts to reach Bagaskoro, but the crocodile's size and the turbidity of the water made effective intervention impossible. The death roll continued in cycles. The animal would pause, reposition, and roll again, dragging Bagaskoro beneath the surface each time. Staff eventually drove the crocodile to the far side, using sustained percussive noise and long poles. The effort took several minutes. When the water finally settled, Bagaskoro Wicaksono's body was recovered from the shallow end. He had died from a combination of fatal bite trauma, drowning, and blood loss sustained during the prolonged death roll. The investigation by Indonesian authorities determined that the platform lacked adequate non-slip surfacing and functional safety railing, and that the facility had no written emergency protocol for keeper immersion during feeding demonstrations. Multiple audience members had recorded portions of the incident on personal phones and cameras. Indonesian police collected copies of all footage from witnesses as part of their criminal investigation into the park's safety standards. Authorities requested that platforms remove clips uploaded in the hours following the incident. The park's owner, facing criminal charges and civil lawsuits from the victim's family, obtained a court order suppressing remaining visual evidence. No complete footage has surfaced publicly. It was March 7th, 2016, and the dry season sun had already pushed temperatures past 80 degrees across the open grasslands of a private wildlife conservancy in southern Kenya. Morning game drive safaris had departed before dawn, open-top Land Cruisers carrying small groups along rutted tracks that wound through golden savanna dotted with scattered acacia. Laurens Dickhorn, a 44-year-old pharmaceutical logistics director from the Netherlands, had arrived at the Conservancy 2 days earlier. The safari was his first, a milestone trip planned around his passion for wildlife, photography. He had invested heavily in professional-grade equipment and spent the previous mornings photographing plains game with visible intensity, often standing in his seat to gain elevation. The morning game drive safari carried Dickhorn and 3 other guests under the guidance of Otieno Kiplagat, a 38-year-old Kenyan guide with over 12 years of conservancy experience. An armed ranger escort accompanied the vehicle, as is standard in some private conservancies. Kiplagat instructed all guests to remain seated inside the vehicle at all times. Kiplagat located a pride of 7 lions resting in tall grass within 20 to 30 yards of the track. The grass obscured the animals from certain angles. Dickhorn attempted several photographs, but grew visibly frustrated with the obstructed sight lines. I keep thinking about how that frustration can override every warning you've been given. You travel thousands of miles for a single photograph, and in that moment, the rules start, feeling like obstacles instead of protection. He climbed down from the Land Cruiser on the far side, briefly out of Kiplagat's immediate line of attention, and moved several yards into the open grass with his camera raised toward the pride. Kiplagat noticed immediately and ordered him back. Tourists in a trailing safari vehicle approximately 40 yards behind had been recording the pride. Their camera captured portions of the incident, though the footage was later submitted to authorities and has never been publicly released. African lions are among the continent's most formidable predators, with adult females weighing up to 280 pounds and capable of reaching speeds approaching 35 miles per hour in short bursts. Lionesses are the primary hunters within a pride, relying on coordinated ambush tactics that exploit tall grass to close distance before prey can react. A lion's killing method relies on a suffocating clamp over the nose and mouth or compression of the major blood vessels in the neck, which can render prey unconscious within minutes. The lioness had been concealed in the grass less than 15 yards from where Dickhorn stood. The charge erupted without warning, covering the distance in barely 2 seconds. The impact struck him from the side and drove him to the ground. His camera tumbled through the grass. A brief struggle followed as the lioness repositioned, attempting to secure a killing hold. The ranger fired, but the attack had already reached a critical stage. 2 seconds. That's the window between standing upright with a camera and being on the ground with no way out. That number is the one that stays with me. Dickhorn was unresponsive at the scene, and later confirmed dead by responding medical personnel. The investigation determined he had exited the vehicle in direct violation of Conservancy rules. Kiplagat and the Conservancy were cleared of liability. This story isn't really about a lion attack. It's about what happens when confidence replaces caution in a place where the margin for error is measured in heartbeats. It was July 23, 2016, and midsummer humidity hung thick over the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, where black bears fattening on wild berries and tourist garbage moved freely through the rental cabins dotting the hillsides above Gatlinburg. For Darren Westbrook, a 38-year-old insurance adjuster from Atlanta, this weekend was supposed to be a celebration. He had booked a mountain property with his wife, Andrea, to mark their 10th wedding anniversary. Andrea had found the listing online, a rustic A-frame with a wraparound porch, mountain views, and a hot tub under the tree canopy. The cabin sat roughly 800 feet from the main road, surrounded by dense hardwood forest typical of the region. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the hill, out of sight and earshot. The isolation was the selling point. The owner had installed a motion-activated security camera above the carport 6 months earlier, following previous incidents with wildlife. A laminated sheet on the refrigerator listed bear safety guidelines, including instructions to store all garbage in the bear-proof bins provided at the end of the driveway. Darren and Andrea spent the afternoon hiking the nearby trails before returning to prepare dinner. The evening had been relaxed. Steaks on the grill, a bottle of wine on the porch, the sound of crickets filling the valley below them. That evening, while cleaning dishes, Andrea noticed movement through the kitchen window. A black bear, estimated later at 180 pounds, was tearing open garbage bags the couple had left near the carport. Andrea suggested they remain inside and let the animal leave on its own. Darren insisted the bear needed to be scared away before it caused property damage they would be charged for. The cabin's garbage had been left unsecured despite posted warnings about bear-proof container requirements. The bear showed no hesitation as it scattered trash across the gravel driveway, behavior consistent with animals repeatedly rewarded for raiding human food sources. Park officials would later determine this was a sub-adult male, approximately 3 years old, reported near rental properties 7 times in the previous 2 months. Each report described the same pattern: garbage left out by visitors, the bear feeding without consequence, and the animal moving on before wildlife officers could respond. Shortly after 9, Darren opened the front door carrying a push broom and a flashlight. Andrea remained inside, but continued to tell her husband to come back. The night was warm and still, with no wind. Insects pulsed in the surrounding trees. Darren crossed the porch and stepped down onto the gravel, sweeping the flashlight beam toward the carport. He approached within roughly 15 feet of the bear, yelling and waving the broom. The bear lifted its head but did not retreat. Its eyes reflected the flashlight with a flat, unblinking stare. Darren stepped closer, swinging the broom toward the animal. American black bears can run up to 30 miles per hour and possess powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. While generally shy of humans, food-conditioned bears lose their natural wariness and may exhibit aggression when confronted directly. Young male bears are disproportionately involved in human conflict situations, particularly when food-conditioned. In rare cases, these bears display predatory behavior rather than defensive responses. The bear charged. The security camera captured Darren stumbling backward and swinging the broom, which struck the animal's shoulder without effect. The bear hit him at full speed, knocking him to the ground near the carport's concrete pad. The flashlight beam swung wildly across the trees before going dark. The bear began biting at Darren's upper body and head. He rolled onto his stomach and covered his neck with his hands, standard defensive posture taught in bear safety courses. The bear did not stop. It bit repeatedly at his back, shoulders, and skull, then briefly paused before resuming the attack with sustained intensity. The assault continued for approximately 2 minutes. Andrea's screams were audible on the camera's audio feed, but she did not exit the cabin. The bear stopped attacking and moved back toward the scattered garbage. It fed for another half-minute before walking into the forest. Andrea called 911 moments later. Responders arrived roughly 15 minutes after the call and found Darren unresponsive in the driveway. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as massive trauma to the head and neck with significant blood loss. Wildlife officers reviewed the security footage and identified the attack as predatory rather than defensive, based on the bear's failure to retreat after the initial contact and its continued feeding behavior afterward. The bear was tracked and euthanized 2 days later, approximately 3 miles from the cabin. It was March 14th, 2015, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and not the part anyone actually talks about. The outskirts, a converted warehouse at the end of a gravel lot with no signage, no ticket booth, nothing marking it from the outside, the kind of place that doesn't exist unless someone tells you where it is. But inside was a whole different story. Enclosures along every wall, heat lamps running, and this smell that hits you the second the door opens. Warm, thick air, wood shavings, live prey. You'd know within about 3 seconds whether you were okay with it or not. Brent Osley was 38, and he had been completely okay with it for almost 20 years. Started out volunteering at a small reptile rescue in his early 20s, eventually went independent, started running private handling demos out of this exact facility for small groups of paying guests. No formal training, no credentials, nothing official attached to his name. Just him, his animals, and a reputation that got passed around by word of mouth among people who were into this world. He'd worked with Burmese pythons more times than he could probably count. Now, before we get into that afternoon, you need to understand what these animals are actually capable of, because I think most people genuinely don't. Full-grown Burmese pythons reach 12 to 18 feet, 100 to 200 pounds. Not venomous, don't need to be. What they do is constrict, and it's almost mechanical. Every time you breathe out, the coils tighten a little more. Your chest tries to rise, it can't. It just keeps going until the snake decides it's done. And here's something even experienced handlers can get complacent about. When a python is in a pre-shed cycle, its eyes cloud over, its stress levels climb, and its tolerance for handling drops way off. It is not the same animal it was 2 weeks ago. You either account for that, or you don't touch it. There's really no middle ground. So with all of that in mind, the facility's big female was right in the middle of that cycle on March 14th. 14 feet, around 140 pounds, had been at that facility for 6 years. Staff had already flagged it. Opaque eyes, slower than usual, quicker to react. They told Brent. He knew. He had 4 guests booked for a private session that afternoon. And he went ahead with it anyway, which honestly makes you wonder, how many times do you have to get away with something before you just stop seeing it as a risk at all? The session started fine. Brent had her draped across his shoulders, walking the group through the basics: movement, feeding behavior, how to read what the snake is doing. She was slow. He played it off as normal. About 12 minutes in, her body tightened across his upper back. He reached back to reposition her the way he'd done 100 times before. She didn't give. A second coil came across his chest. And right there, that's the moment. That's where everything changes. Because what happens next moves faster than anyone in that room was ready for. The coils lock. Both his hands go straight to the loop across his sternum, and he cannot get his fingers underneath it. Her tail wraps his left arm and anchors. Third loop, upper chest and left shoulder. He goes to one knee. Can you even imagine being one of those 4 guests right now? You paid to watch a handling demo and suddenly the guy running it is on the floor and the snake is not letting go. 2 of them tried pulling the coils off. They couldn't do it. A 140-pound animal in full constriction is not something too panicking. People can just unwrap with their hands. There was no second handler in that room, and I've said this before, that single handler detail shows up in so many of these cases. It's almost its own pattern at this point. 4 minutes from full engagement to Brent going completely still. 4 minutes. The other staff member had been in a back room the entire time. Someone got emergency services on the phone. 11 minutes for help to arrive. Brent was pronounced dead at the scene. The post-mortem confirmed traumatic asphyxia due to constriction. 3 ribs fractured on the left side, 2 on the right, consistent with sustained pressure from a large constrictor in full engagement. Petechial hemorrhaging on his face and neck was consistent with compressive asphyxia. Contributing factors included the snake's pre-shed physiological state, no second handler present, and the decision to proceed with the session after the behavioral flags had already been documented by staff. The facility was reviewed and closed shortly after. The snake was transferred to another facility. The case was ruled accidental. No criminal charges were filed.
It was the 9th of March 2015 at a small privately owned reptile attraction in Central Florida where midday heat settled flat across low concrete enclosures and the air carried the mineral smell of standing water. The facility ran live demonstrations and educational presentations, drawing families and regional tourists through a modest set of exhibit areas. Behind reinforced viewing barriers, one enclosure held the facility's largest resident, a massive Nile crocodile used for feeding demonstrations. Nolan Pike, 24, was a prank format content creator whose entire model was built around confrontation, rule violations, and filmed consequences. His audience rewarded him for provoking staff, ignoring restrictions, and engineering situations that put him somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He visited the facility alongside a cameraman and a friend. Throughout the visit, Nolan openly mocked the trained handlers and joked that the crocodile appeared fake due to its prolonged stillness. That detail bothers me more than almost anything else in this story. Those handlers know that animal through every feeding and every behavioral shift. Nolan had been in the building for an hour and decided they were the ones who didn't understand it. Staff were occupied preparing a nearby feeding demonstration, and a maintenance access gate adjacent to the viewing platform was left unsecured. Nolan saw it. The decision he made in that moment is exactly the kind of decision that prank content rewards. Push past the barrier, get the reaction, film it. The problem is that the animal on the other side doesn't care about the format. What most observers misread about Nile crocodiles is that the stillness is not inactivity, it is the operational state. An adult Nile crocodile can measure between 13 and 16 feet in length and weigh anywhere from 500 to over 1,600 pounds. Their thermoregulation requires extended periods of near motionless basking that leads untrained observers to drastically underestimate them. The recorded bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch. More critically, a crocodile that has been motionless for hours can cover several feet and close its jaws in a fraction of a second. Most untrained observers never recognize the warning signs before the strike occurs. Nolan slipped past the unsecured gate while the cameraman filmed from outside the barrier. He moved to the edge of the enclosure and leaned over the wall, reaching toward the animal's snout. The crocodile exploded from the waterline without warning, clamping onto his arm and dragging him against the enclosure edge before pulling him into the water. Witnesses described immediate violent churning as the animal began rolling. Staff evacuated nearby visitors while handlers attempted to separate the crocodile using poles before emergency crews could access Nolan. By the time personnel safely reached him, Nolan had already sustained catastrophic injuries. Nolan Pike was declared dead at the scene. The cameraman's footage from outside the barrier was recovered and reviewed by investigators during the compliance inquiry. It was not publicly released. The facility's legal representatives and Nolan's family both requested it remain out of public circulation. The facility later faced regulatory penalties and temporary suspension. What investigators found during the post-incident review was a pattern of minor compliance gaps that had accumulated over time insufficient staffing ratios during peak visitor hours, irregular gate checks during staff transitions, and inadequate separation between public access areas and maintenance corridors. None of those individual gaps would necessarily have produced a fatal outcome on their own. Combined with a visitor who was actively looking for a way past the restrictions, they created a pathway that shouldn't have existed. That's something I think about with a lot of these cases. The way small, individually manageable failures stack up on top of each other until they're not manageable at all.
It was April 7th, 2015, and the air across central Romania carried the damp chill of a season still struggling to turn. A regional municipal zoo on the outskirts of a mid-sized city opened its gates to a mostly empty parking lot. The morning air smelled of damp concrete and animal feed. Budget shortfalls had reduced the staff to a skeleton crew. The zoo housed a pair of Siberian tigers in an outdoor enclosure connected to an indoor holding area by a heavy steel sliding gate. The enclosure itself was a rectangular concrete space, roughly the size of a tennis court, bordered on 3 sides by high walls, and on the 4th by a viewing gallery that had been closed to the public for months due to structural concerns. Maintenance logs dating back over a year had flagged the gate's latch mechanism as unreliable, noting that the bolt did not always seat fully into its housing, leaving the gate dependent on friction rather than a fully engaged locking pin. Replacement parts had been requested, but never approved. Dragomir Petrescu, a 54-year-old senior keeper, had worked at the zoo for over 2 decades. His long tenure had earned him the trust of management and the deference of younger staff, but it had also produced a familiarity with routine that had dulled his attention to protocol. Dragomir had cleaned the tiger enclosure hundreds of times without incident, and that repetition had become its own kind of danger. The zoo used a lockout board system to track animal locations during cleaning. Before any keeper entered an enclosure, the corresponding animal was to be shifted into a holding area, the shift marked on the board. and a second visual confirmation made through the holding pen bars before enclosure entry. On this morning, Dragomir checked the board and saw the shift marked as complete by a colleague from the earlier feeding round. After decades of routine, he relied solely on the board marking and skipped the visual verification. With two keepers absent that morning, Dragomir was covering the enclosure alone. He collected his cleaning equipment and entered the outdoor enclosure. The mark on the board had been made in good faith. The colleague had initiated the shift, guiding the male tiger toward the holding area with feeding cues. But the gate's latch had not engaged fully. The tiger, a roughly 540-pound captive male, had initially moved into the holding area, but subsequently forced the partially latched sliding gate open with its head and forelimbs, re-entering the outdoor enclosure. Liviu Aldea, a 31-year-old junior keeper assigned to the big cat section within the last year, was carrying supplies toward the enclosure from the service building when events began to unfold. Siberian tigers, also known as Amur tigers, are the largest living cat species, with captive males commonly weighing between 400 and 660 pounds. They are ambush predators that strike from behind, targeting the neck and base of the skull to compress the throat or damage the cervical vertebrae. Their bite force can exceed 900 pounds per square inch. In captive settings, tigers retain all predatory instincts regardless of years of human contact, and attacks on keepers are almost always triggered by proximity in enclosed spaces where the animal's ambush instincts activate. The tiger had re-entered the enclosure silently, moving along the concrete wall on the far side. Dragomir, facing away while hosing down the floor, did not see the animal. Based on the scene reconstruction conducted by investigators, the tiger closed the distance rapidly and struck from behind, the full weight of the animal hitting Dragomir in the upper back and knocking him violently to the concrete floor. The tiger's jaws clamped around the back of his neck, maintaining a crushing bite while attempting to drag him across the concrete, compressing the carotid arteries and trachea, while the canines penetrated deep into the neck musculature, causing catastrophic trauma and rapid loss of consciousness. Liviu reached the perimeter fence moments later and saw the attack in progress. He triggered the emergency alert system and shouted towards the service building. Staff began arriving within roughly a minute. The combined commotion from vehicles, air horns, and shouting eventually pushed the tiger toward the holding area, where it was secured, but the damage had already been done. Dragomir lay motionless on the enclosure floor. Emergency medical services were called immediately, but the zoo's location outside the city center meant a response delay of approximately 20 minutes. Dragomir Petrescu was pronounced dead at the scene. He had survived 23 years working alongside some of the most dangerous predators on Earth. The investigation by local prosecutors and workplace safety authorities determined that the gate latch mechanism had failed to engage properly, and that the zoo's lockout verification protocol had not been followed with adequate rigor. The facility was cited for multiple safety violations. The zoo's internal CCTV system had captured the enclosure from a fixed overhead angle. Local prosecutors seized the footage as primary evidence in the workplace negligence investigation. The footage was retained as evidence during ongoing legal proceedings and has not surfaced publicly. It was July 14th, 2017, and the winter sun hung low over the dry thornveld of a private game reserve in South Africa's Limpopo province. The reserve bordered one of the country's largest national parks, sharing unfenced boundaries that allowed elephants and other large animals to move freely. Afternoon game drive safaris departed daily from the lodge in open Land Rovers. Sunel Bezuidenhout, a 51-year-old retired school headmistress from Stellenbosch, had booked the safari holiday through a domestic travel agency. She had arrived 2 days earlier with a small group of friends and had no particular wildlife experience beyond occasional park visits. The afternoon game drive safari was led by Thabiso Ndaba, a 29-year-old guide who had obtained certification 4 years earlier but had limited experience handling high-risk elephant encounters. The vehicle carried 5 guests. What unsettles me about this setup is that most guests on a safari have absolutely no way of knowing whether their guide has 2 years of experience or 20. You place your life in someone else's hands the moment you climb into that vehicle, and you never think to question it. Approximately 2 hours in, Ndaba located a female elephant and a young calf near a waterhole. He maneuvered off the main track, closing the distance to approximately 25 yards, closer than typically recommended for elephants with calves. The female detected the approach immediately, ears flaring wide and head lifting to face the vehicle. A dashboard-mounted camera recorded part of the incident, though much of the critical footage is obscured after the vehicle was overturned. Guests in a second vehicle, roughly 80 yards away, also recorded portions of the encounter. African elephants are the largest land animals on Earth, with adult females weighing between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds. Females with calves are among the most dangerous wildlife encounters on the continent. Elephants communicate agitation through warning signals, including ear flaring, head shaking, and mock charges. When these warnings fail, the response escalates to a full charge at speeds exceeding 20 miles per hour, with enough mass to overturn vehicles. Every single warning sign was visible: the ears, the head shaking, the mock charges, and still the vehicle didn't move fast enough. That's the part that's difficult to accept. The signals were all there, and they weren't enough. The elephant issued 2 mock charges, lunging forward with ears spread wide before pulling up short. Ndaba began reversing, but the rear wheels caught in soft sand, slowing the retreat. After repeated mock charges, the elephant committed fully. She closed the remaining distance in seconds, striking the vehicle broadside and forcing it onto its side after repeated impact. Bezuidenhout was thrown from the exposed upper tier. She landed between the overturned vehicle and the charging elephant. The animal struck and trampled her before she could move, then continued to push and strike the vehicle briefly before retreating toward her calf. Bezuidenhout was pronounced dead at the scene from crushing injuries. Ndaba and remaining guests survived with injuries. What makes this one sit so heavy with me is that Bezuidenhout did nothing wrong. She trusted her guide, stayed in her seat, and followed every rule. Sometimes survival depends entirely on decisions someone else makes for you, and that's a terrifying thing to sit with. The investigation found Ndaba had positioned the vehicle well inside safe distance and failed to withdraw at the first signs of agitation. The reserve suspended Ndaba and overhauled training protocols. No action was taken against the elephant. The dashboard footage was submitted to investigators as part of a civil liability review and has not been officially released. The second vehicle's footage was shared privately, though portions later appeared on social media. It was November 8, 2014, and the subarctic darkness had already begun swallowing Churchill, Manitoba, where barely 8 hours of pale daylight separated the long, frozen nights, and hundreds of polar bears gathered along the coast, waiting for Hudson Bay to freeze so they could return to hunting seals on the ice. For Dr. Vaughn Kirkstead, a 43-year-old wildlife biologist from Winnipeg, this was familiar territory. He was in his 3rd season studying bear behavior patterns at a remote research outpost operated by a Canadian Wildlife Research Consortium, roughly 18 miles from Churchill's town center. The building was a reinforced modular structure, elevated on pilings, with small double-paned windows and a single steel entry door that opened inward. The surrounding terrain was flat and exposed, tundra scrub with no trees and minimal cover, offering little concealment for anything approaching except darkness itself. On clear days, you could see for miles. On overcast November evenings, visibility dropped to almost nothing within minutes of sunset. The facility's perimeter was protected by an electric fence system designed to deter polar bear approaches. The fence had proven reliable for 6 years, delivering a non-lethal but effective shock to any animal making contact. On the morning of November 8th, a power fluctuation caused by degraded wiring went undetected. The fence appeared operational based on indicator lights in the main building, but actual current to the perimeter lines had dropped to less than 20% of normal levels, enough to register on diagnostics, but not enough to deter a large bear. Dr. Kirkstead spent most of the day analyzing data from GPS collars deployed on bears earlier that fall. Weather reports showed temperatures dropping to -12 degrees Fahrenheit, with sunset expected in the late afternoon. Standard protocol required all exterior work to be completed before dusk and mandated that no one exit the building without an armed escort. Shortly after dusk, Dr. Kirkstead noticed that a weather monitoring station roughly 40 feet from the main entrance was showing erratic readings. He informed his colleagues he would retrieve the device quickly to assess whether ice buildup was affecting the sensors. One colleague reminded him of the escort rule. Dr. Kirkstead told him he would only be outside for a minute. Exterior surveillance cameras recorded him exiting the building moments later. Wearing a heavy parka and carrying a flashlight, he walked directly toward the weather station without scanning his surroundings. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of him across frozen ground. Beyond it, darkness closed in completely. A polar bear appeared at the edge of the camera's field of view seconds later, approaching from the northwest at a steady walk. Its white coat blended almost completely with the snow-covered tundra behind it. It moved without urgency, head low, eyes fixed on the figure ahead. Polar bears are the largest bear species, with adult males weighing between 900 and 1,600 pounds. Unlike brown and black bears, polar bears are apex predators that evolved to hunt seals on sea ice and regularly view humans as potential prey. They are capable of silent stalking behavior, often approaching from downwind to avoid detection. Their sense of smell can detect prey from distances exceeding 1 mile. During late fall near Churchill, bears in a hyperphagia state are particularly motivated by hunger as they await ice formation. The bear closed to within roughly 30 feet before Dr. Kirkstead turned and saw it. He immediately ran toward the building's entrance. The bear accelerated into a full charge. It covered the distance before Dr. Kirkstead reached the door, striking him from behind and dragging him to the ground just feet from the entrance. The attack was swift and focused, with the bear biting repeatedly at his head and neck. Colleagues inside the building heard the commotion and looked through windows, but could not safely intervene without firearms, which were stored in a secured rack inside the building. One researcher activated the emergency alarm, while another retrieved the rifle. By the time someone exited the building with the weapon roughly 90 seconds later, the bear had already begun dragging Dr. Kirkstead's body away from the structure. A single rifle shot struck the ground near the bear, causing it to release the body and retreat roughly 50 yards. It remained visible in the area for another 10 minutes before leaving. Researchers reached Dr. Kirkstead and found no signs of life. Local law enforcement and wildlife officers arrived via helicopter. The medical examiner determined death resulted from massive trauma to the head and neck, consistent with a predatory attack. Investigation of the electric fence revealed the power failure. Footage from surveillance cameras showed the polar bear had been circling the outpost for at least 15 minutes before Dr. Kirkstead exited, testing the fence line at multiple points without receiving a deterrent shock. Facility protocols were updated following the incident to include mandatory fence testing and armed exterior escorts, regardless of task duration. It was June 9th, 2014. The Atchafalaya Basin in south-central Louisiana is one of the largest river swamps in the United States. A dense, slow-moving maze of cypress trees, black water, and floating vegetation stretching across nearly 1 million acres. In the summer, the air sits heavy with humidity. Visibility drops to just a few feet in any direction, and the undergrowth is thick enough to swallow a person whole. Irvin Rick was 27 years old, a graduate-level field researcher working on a cottonmouth population study as part of his thesis. He'd been running fieldwork in the basin for 2 seasons under a faculty supervisor, but frequently went out on his own. He was methodical, kept detailed logs, knew the terrain well, and honestly, that's probably part of what made this so easy to miss coming. He wasn't the type to take stupid risks. What he did do was normalize the danger over time. 2 seasons of close contact snake work without a serious incident had quietly shifted his sense of what was acceptable. On June 9th, he went into the field alone, didn't tell anyone his exact entry point, and went in without a working emergency communicator. His satellite device had a cracked charging port and had died the night before. His only backup was a cell phone with no signal in the interior of the basin. He went anyway. Here's the thing about eastern diamondbacks that I think gets underestimated. People hear rattlesnake and picture something that gives you fair warning. That's not always how it goes. Eastern diamondbacks are the largest venomous snakes in North America. Adults commonly reaching 5 to 6 feet and exceeding 10 pounds. They're ambush predators. They don't patrol or chase. They wait, and they strike when something enters their space without either party knowing until it's already happening. In dense vegetation, where you're on top of each other before you've seen anything, that's exactly the kind of encounter that ends badly. Their venom is potently hemotoxic. It destroys tissue, breaks down the blood's ability to clot, and triggers systemic hemorrhaging. A full envenomation from a large adult, untreated, can be fatal within several hours. Irvin had been in the field for about 3 hours when it happened. He was moving through a section of dense sedge grass near a slow-moving channel, using a hook to part the vegetation ahead of him. Standard protocol. The diamondback was completely hidden in the grass until he was within striking distance. It didn't rattle. It struck upward and caught him on the inner left thigh, just below the groin. He pulled back immediately, but the damage was already done. A large diamondback delivers a significant venom load, and the inner thigh is dense with vasculature. Absorption into the bloodstream is fast, and what follows systemically is not something you can manage in the field. He applied pressure with his hand and started moving back toward his entry point, a flat-bottomed boat anchored roughly 600 feet away through dense vegetation. Doesn't sound that far, right? But the terrain made every step slow. Within 15 minutes, his left leg had swollen significantly, and the pain had spread into his hip and lower abdomen. He kept moving. He documented the bite in his field notebook. Time, location on his body, approximate size of the snake, and kept pushing toward the boat. He didn't stop to rest, which likely increased circulation and accelerated venom distribution through his system. He made it about 400 feet before he sat down against a cypress root. His notebook entries, recovered later, showed handwriting that got progressively harder to read. The last legible entry was a rough GPS coordinate written from memory and a few words indicating he couldn't stand. His phone showed no outgoing calls, no signal, no way to reach anyone. He had no other options. He just sat there. His body was found 2 days later by another researcher who had gone looking after Irvin failed to return or make contact. He was still seated against that cypress root, his field notebook open in his lap, his snake hook still in his right hand. The post-mortem confirmed he died from the effects of envenomation, systemic coagulopathy, internal hemorrhaging, and hypovolemic shock, compounded by exertion in extreme heat with no fluids and no medical intervention. His field notebook, phone, and a dead GPS unit were all recovered at the scene. His notebook had entries up to about 40 minutes after the bite. His phone had no outgoing calls, no signal, nothing to call with. The death was ruled accidental.
It was the 14th of October 2016, in the remote woodland of northern Montana, where autumn had already stripped the aspens to bare branches and frost crept across the clearing each morning. Regional wildlife managers had posted warnings about unusually aggressive bear activity throughout the area that season. Residents from surrounding properties had reported damaged structures, overturned debris, and escalating encounters for weeks. Rowan Vale, 27, was a wilderness travel content creator from Oregon, whose videos centered on off-grid living, remote landscapes, and what she marketed as authentic encounters with the natural world. Her earlier work had built a modest but loyal following. As her audience grew, pressure from sponsors followed, pushing toward increasingly extreme footage. She had no formal wildlife training, and her understanding of bear behavior came largely from outdoor forums and the kind of confidence built from never being seriously tested. She rented a private cabin in isolated woodland outside any managed park boundary, accompanied by a cameraman and a photographer. The nearest occupied property sat over a mile away, Local wildlife managers had already circulated warnings about unusually aggressive pre-hibernation bear activity that autumn, but Rowan treated that danger as an asset rather than a reason to reconsider. And that's the part that stays with me. The warnings weren't buried in some internal report. They were public, and the response was to treat them as a selling point. Over several days, the group left fish remains and food scraps near the edge of the tree line to attract wildlife for nighttime footage. Wildlife officers later suspected the bear had already been obtaining unsecured food from neighboring rural properties before arriving at the cabin, which would explain how quickly it lost its avoidance behavior around the group. A large grizzly began appearing near the property each evening. At first, it held at the tree line. Over the following nights, it stayed longer, moved closer, and stopped retreating when the group made noise. I think this is where a lot of people reading this for the first time start to feel uncomfortable. Leaving fish remains near a remote cabin in grizzly country during hyperphagia season isn't a gray area. Every piece of outdoor safety literature that covers bear country addresses this directly, and the group did it repeatedly, over multiple days, deliberately. During one encounter, the bear performed a bluff charge after catching the scent of food near the clearing's edge. Rowan dismissed it on camera and continued filming. The moment the bluff charge became dismissed as content is the one I keep coming back to, because that was the clearest possible signal that the situation had produced. What matters here is what a grizzly bear in late October actually represents biologically. The period known as hyperphagia drives adult grizzlies to consume up to 20,000 calories per day, compelling them to range widely, take risks they would otherwise avoid, and respond aggressively to anything threatening access to a food source. An adult male grizzly at this stage can weigh between 400 and 790 pounds and cover ground at nearly 35 miles per hour. A bear that has stopped retreating from human presence and associates a location with reliable food is no longer exhibiting avoidance behavior. Repeated bluff charges during food conditioning incidents are considered a major escalation warning by wildlife officers. On the final evening, the bear approached the clearing again, moving toward the scraps near the tree line. Rowan closed the distance to continue filming, despite the bear remaining actively engaged with the food source. The bear reacted instantly. The cameraman dropped the equipment and ran. The photographer barricaded herself inside the cabin and contacted emergency services. Due to the remote terrain, responders did not reach the property for several hours. Footage recorded during earlier sessions that evening was later reviewed by investigators. At the request of Rowan's family, that material was not publicly released and has remained out of circulation since. Wildlife officials confirmed the bear had become fully food conditioned through repeated exposure to human attractants. The behavior the group had interpreted as habituation was escalating defensive aggression around a reliable food source. What the subsequent investigation also revealed was that the volume of material left near the tree line over the course of several days was sufficient to establish the clearing as a consistent food source in the bear's behavioral pattern. When I read through the officer's assessment notes, what struck me was the language they used. They didn't describe the bear as aggressive. They described it as conditioned. That distinction matters because it means the animal wasn't acting outside its normal behavior. It was acting exactly within it. The conditions had simply been engineered to make that behavior fatal. Rowan Vale was found deceased at the property. She was 27 years old. The cabin was taken out of service pending formal review, and wildlife managers reinforced regional advisories across the area. What I keep coming back to is that none of what happened was unforeseeable. The bear's behavior escalated in a clear sequence over multiple days. The bluff charge alone should have ended it entirely.
It was October 22, 2014, and a cold rain had been falling over a regional city in the Republic of Georgia since before dawn. A small zoological facility on the city's northern edge opened for another sparsely attended weekday. Puddles had formed along the cracked pathways between enclosures, and the grounds were empty of visitors. The facility housed several Caucasian brown bears in adjoining enclosures. The zoo had been built during the Soviet era and received minimal upgrades since its service corridors narrow and poorly lit. The bears were shifted between outdoor areas and indoor holding pens through manual gates operated from the service corridor. Communication between keepers relied entirely on verbal confirmation. There was no lockout board, no written shift log, and no redundant verification system. Zurab Lomidze was a 29-year-old keeper hired approximately 8 months earlier. He had come to the zoo from agricultural labor in a rural district outside the city, drawn by the modest but steady salary. He had no formal zoological training, his orientation consisting of several days shadowing a senior keeper before being assigned to the bear section independently. The morning routine required cleaning the bear enclosures while the animals were secured in holding pens. A senior colleague was responsible for shifting each bear and verbally confirming the lockout. On this morning, the miscommunication was simple and fatal. The senior keeper believed the shift had already been completed by another staff member who had passed through earlier. He relayed this assumption to Zurab as confirmation. No one had actually moved the bear. Zurab unlocked the service door and entered the narrow corridor between the inner wall and the enclosure's rock features. The Caucasian brown bear, a roughly 380-pound adult female, was still inside. Brown bears are among the most powerful terrestrial predators in the northern hemisphere, with Caucasian brown bear females typically weighing between 250 and 400 pounds, and males exceeding 450 pounds. Despite their smaller stature compared to some subspecies, Caucasian brown bears are exceptionally powerful. Brown bears are not typically predatory toward humans, but become extremely dangerous when startled at close range, particularly in confined spaces where escape routes are blocked. Defensive attacks are fast and violent, involving swipes from claws often exceeding 3 inches in length and bite force approaching 900 pounds per square inch. Most captive bear attacks occur during enclosure entry, when keepers mistakenly believe the animal has been secured. Zurab encountered the bear almost immediately. The confined space, less than 6 feet wide between the rock wall and the enclosure barrier, left no room for retreat. The bear, startled by the sudden appearance of a human at close range, reacted defensively. According to the scene reconstruction conducted by investigators, the bear lunged forward and rose partially onto its hind legs, delivering a powerful swipe that struck Zurab across the upper body and knocked him against the corridor wall. The bear followed immediately with a bite to his shoulder and upper chest. The crushing force caused massive tissue damage to his collarbone and the surrounding area. The attack lasted less than half a minute before the bear retreated deeper into the enclosure, but the injuries sustained in the confined corridor were unsurvivable. Staff heard the commotion and reached the service door within roughly a minute, but were unable to enter safely until the bear was lured into the holding pen with food. Zurab Lomidze was found unresponsive in the corridor. Emergency medical services were called, but the injuries were incompatible with survival. He was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. He was 29 years old and had worked at the zoo for less than a year. The investigation determined that a verbal miscommunication between staff members had resulted in the keeper entering an unsecured enclosure and that the facility lacked any formal lockout verification system. The zoo's single-functioning security camera had captured a partial angle of the corridor entrance. Georgian authorities reviewed the footage during their investigation into operational negligence. The footage was retained as evidence while the case remained active. The zoo closed permanently within the following year, and the footage remains restricted in court evidence archives. It was August 9th, 2018, and the Zambezi River moved sluggishly through the floodplain of Zimbabwe's Mana Pools region, its waters reduced by peak dry season to a fraction of their volume. The shrinking river had concentrated massive pods of hippopotamus into crowded pools and reed channels, with territorial males defending diminishing space. A small safari lodge operated multi-day canoe safari excursions along this stretch. Rosalind Critchlow, a 57-year-old retired solicitor from Bath, England, had booked the 3-day canoe safari as the final leg of a southern African itinerary. An experienced traveler, she had never undertaken a river-based safari. She completed a paddling orientation at the lodge before departure. The canoe safari group of 4 canoes carrying 8 guests was led by Takudzwa Chirinda, a 34-year-old Zimbabwean river guide with over 8 years of Zambezi experience. Chirinda briefed the group that hippopods would be given wide clearance, travel would be single file, and his navigation decisions were final. Something about canoe safaris has always made me uneasy. On a game drive, you have a vehicle, an engine, metal around you. On the water, you have a thin shell of fiberglass and a paddle. That's the entire barrier between you and whatever's underneath. The first day passed without incident. The second morning, low water had visibly compressed the channel, and hippo activity was heavier. Chirinda navigated along the main channel, steering clear of known hippo concentrations. The guest paddling behind Critchlow's canoe was wearing a head-mounted action camera. The camera recorded the capsizing, though the footage becomes submerged and chaotic within seconds of the impact. Hippopotamuses are widely regarded as one of the leading causes of large animal-related deaths in Africa. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. Their massive jaws open nearly 180 degrees, revealing lower canines exceeding 16 inches. Bite force exceeds 1,800 pounds per square inch. During dry season, shrinking water forces territorial males into closer proximity with rivals, dramatically increasing aggression. Solitary males displaced from pods are considered particularly dangerous, occupying unpredictable positions and responding to intrusion with immediate violence. That last detail is the one that really gets to me. A displaced male doesn't belong to a pod, doesn't stay in a known pool, and doesn't follow the patterns that guides have spent years memorizing. It's the one variable you can't plan for. The solitary male had been submerged in a section of the channel not known to contain a pod. Chirinda had no indication of its presence. The hippo surfaced directly beside Critchlow's canoe, its massive head rising from the brown water. It struck the canoe broadside, capsizing it instantly and throwing Critchlow into the shallower edge of the channel. I keep coming back to the randomness of it. A few yards to the left or right, and the hippo surfaces beside a different canoe or misses them entirely. That's the margin. A few yards on a river that stretches for thousands of miles. The hippo lunged toward her in the shallows. Its jaws opened wide and came down on her midsection. The animal bit down with crushing force and jerked violently, then released before submerging and circling back. Briefly, Chirinda paddled back and struck the water with his paddle in an attempt to distract the animal, causing it to disengage, but the initial assault had already caused fatal damage. Just imagining Chirinda turning that canoe around and paddling toward a 4,000-pound hippo with nothing but a paddle. That's a kind of courage most people never have to find in themselves, and even that wasn't enough. Chirinda and another guest lifted Critchlow onto a sandbar. He radioed the lodge for emergency evacuation. She had sustained catastrophic crushing injuries and showed no signs of breathing by the time the evacuation boat arrived approximately 40 minutes later. She was later declared dead. The investigation determined Chirinda had navigated correctly, avoided all known hippo concentrations, and followed standard procedures. The displaced male's position was unforeseeable. Chirinda was cleared of all fault. Canoe safari operations were temporarily suspended pending a safety review, and the Wildlife Authority issued an advisory on hippo displacement risks during low water conditions. The footage was submitted as evidence during a coroner's inquest and has not been made publicly available. This is the story that stays with me the longest, not because someone broke the rules or made a bad call, but because everything was done right, and it still wasn't enough. Sometimes the river just decides, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. It was May 4th, 2013, and early spring had barely loosened winter's grip on one of Wyoming's national forests, where snowpack still blanketed the higher elevations, and grizzly bears were emerging from their dens hungry, defensive, and unpredictable. For Trent Mallory, a 51-year-old outdoors enthusiast from Denver, this was the time of year he looked forward to most. He had been visiting the region each spring for nearly a decade, preferring early-season hikes when trails were less crowded, though this timing coincided with the period when grizzlies were particularly active. He had hiked this region enough times to feel comfortable in it, comfortable enough to go alone. Friends later said Trent was cautious by nature, the type who checked weather reports twice and always told someone his route before leaving. He had filed a trip plan with the Forest Service office that morning. Trent began hiking early that morning from a trailhead at approximately 6,400 feet elevation. Conditions were clear with temperatures in the low 40s. Snowpack remained significant at higher elevations, but the trail followed a south-facing slope where melt-off had exposed ground. Patches of mud held tracks from elk and mule deer, and the forest smelled of wet earth and pine. He carried a day pack containing water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a compact video camera he used to document wildlife and landscapes. Bear spray was clipped to his chest harness in accordance with regional recommendations. By mid-morning, Trent had hiked roughly 3 miles into the backcountry. The trail had narrowed to a boot-width track through patches of snow and exposed rock. He stopped at a clearing that offered views across a drainage basin and decided to film a panoramic sweep of the area. He positioned the camera on a flat rock, set it to record, and stepped back to capture himself delivering a brief narration about the location. The camera continued recording after he finished speaking. The clearing was quiet. No birds called. The only sound was wind moving through the trees upslope. Early May represents one of the most dangerous periods for human-bear encounters in the region. Grizzly bears emerge from dens in a state of heightened defensiveness, often aggressively protecting food sources or den sites. Males may have been out of their dens for several weeks, but females with new cubs typically emerge later and remain near den sites for days before traveling longer distances. Bears in this state are highly sensitive to disturbance and may attack with minimal provocation. Adult grizzlies possess immense strength and can charge at speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour. Shortly after, while Trent was adjusting his pack roughly 15 feet from the camera, a grizzly bear emerged from a stand of trees about 40 yards upslope. The bear's appearance was sudden, with no advance noise or warning. Based on forensic analysis of the video footage and scene reconstruction, investigators later theorized that Trent had unknowingly approached within 200 yards of a den site where the bear had denned through the winter. The bear, estimated at roughly 450 pounds, had likely been denning in the area, though no cubs were visible on camera or at the scene. Trent saw the bear and reached for his bear spray. The bear charged immediately, covering the slope in seconds. Trent discharged the spray, but the timing was off, and the stream passed to the bear's left without making contact. The bear hit him with full force, knocking him backward into the rocks where the camera sat. The camera's angle shifted but continued recording audio and partial video of the surrounding trees. The sounds captured on the recording indicated a sustained attack lasting approximately 1 minute, with vocalizations from the bear and impact sounds consistent with biting and striking. The bear left the area shortly after, based on audio analysis showing receding movement through vegetation. Trent's body was discovered by other hikers that afternoon when they passed through the clearing and noticed the camera still recording. They did not approach closely after seeing the scene and immediately hiked back to the trailhead to report the incident. Park rangers and wildlife officers arrived several hours later via helicopter. They confirmed Trent's death and secured the area. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was massive trauma to the head, chest, and abdomen. Rangers retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage. Combined with physical evidence at the scene, they concluded the attack was a defensive response by a bear protecting a den site. Trent's actions showed proper preparedness with bear spray and camera documentation, but the bear's proximity and sudden emergence left insufficient time for effective deterrence. The area was temporarily closed to hiking, and signs warning of recent grizzly activity were posted at surrounding trailheads. It was February 18, 2017, Clarksville, Tennessee, a residential property at the end of a long gravel driveway, tree line on 3 sides. Nothing unusual about it from the road. The main house was completely ordinary. The garage attached to it was not. Podden Quelch was 41. a former exotic pet store employee who had spent the last decade building a private collection of venomous reptiles. No formal training, no veterinary background, no permits for the animals he kept, several of which required a licensed facility to own legally in Tennessee. He had been bitten before, twice by a monocled cobra, once by a gaboon viper. He had handled all 3 incidents himself, no medical intervention, and walked away fine each time. And I think that's the part that really set the stage for what happened here. Because 3 survivable bites don't teach you that you're careful. They teach you that you're untouchable. Those are very different lessons. So let's talk about king cobras for a second, because I think the reputation precedes them, but people don't always know why. These are the longest venomous snakes in the world. Adults reach 10 to 13 feet and can weigh up to 20 pounds. They can raise the front third of their body off the ground, putting a bite at chest height on a standing person. Their venom is neurotoxic. It interferes with nerve signals and causes progressive paralysis that eventually stops the muscles responsible for breathing. Without antivenom, that process can be fatal within hours. And what makes them especially unforgiving is that they're highly sensitive to handler behavior, stress, imprecise movement, unfamiliar scent. They pick up on all of it, and they react to it. Paden's king cobra was an 11-foot male he had owned for 3 years. On the evening of February 18th, he was transferring it from its primary enclosure to a temporary container for routine cleaning, a procedure he had done before, using a hook and a tube, standard tools for this kind of work. What wasn't standard was that he was doing it alone, at night after spending several hours drinking. A neighbor who had spoken to him earlier that evening said he seemed relaxed, unhurried, completely unbothered, which, given what was about to happen, is a hard detail to sit with. The transfer went wrong when Paden tried to guide the snake into the tube. The cobra pulled back, reared, and struck twice in fast succession, once on the right forearm, once on the back of the right hand. Both strikes clean. Paden pulled back and looked at the bites. And then he did something that is genuinely hard to understand from the outside. He didn't call for help. He secured the enclosure, walked into the house, and sat down at the kitchen table. Based on notes found later, his reasoning seemed to be that he had survived bites before, and that calling for help would mean his collection getting seized. So he took an antihistamine, which does absolutely nothing against neurotoxic venom, and wrote down the time of the bites. He noted the location of both strikes. His last written entry was time-stamped at 9:47 p.m. He wrote that he felt okay for now. He was not okay. Neurotoxic venom from a king cobra works progressively. Muscle weakness sets in first, then difficulty swallowing, then breathing becomes labored as the muscles controlling the airway and chest begin to fail. A double envenomation accelerates that entire process. Based on the physical evidence, Paden had moved from the kitchen table to the floor sometime around 10:30 p.m., not a controlled movement. His body was found the following morning by a friend who had come by after getting no response to calls or messages. Paden was on the kitchen floor, roughly 6 feet from the table. His notes were still on the table. The pen had rolled to the edge. He had been dead for several hours by the time anyone found him. When investigators pieced it together, the timeline was clear. 2 strike sites on his right arm and hand, both consistent with a defensive attack during a transfer attempt. The combined venom load had caused progressive respiratory failure. The antihistamine he took had no effect on that whatsoever. The case was ruled accidental. His notes time-stamped at 9:47 p.m., and a phone with no outgoing calls after 8:30 p.m. told most of the story. The secured enclosure confirmed he had been lucid enough to contain the snake before walking inside. 11 additional venomous snakes were recovered from the garage, several requiring permits he didn't have. All were seized and transferred to licensed facilities.
It was the 22nd of July, 2017, several miles off the coast of Oahu, Hawaii, where the water dropped fast from turquoise shallows into deep blue-green open ocean. Visibility underwater shifted with current and plankton concentration, meaning anything approaching would appear at close range before being seen. Kieran Holt, 31, was an ocean adventure content creator who presented himself as a seasoned marine specialist. In practice, he lacked advanced dive certification and had developed his techniques primarily through observation and imitation of professional footage. He organized an unofficial offshore shark dive with a fellow content creator, describing the planned footage as career-defining. Multiple licensed charter operators declined the booking after confirming neither Holt nor his partner held the required qualifications. A private boat operator eventually agreed to take them out. That detail matters. Professional operators who work those waters looked at this booking and said no. The fact that Kieran kept looking until someone agreed didn't change what those first operators saw. The two descended into deep offshore water, carrying handheld cameras. Visibility was limited, currents were disorienting, and a large tiger shark appeared and began making slow, repeated passes at close range. Tiger sharks are one of the most broadly distributed large shark species in the Pacific and account for a significant proportion of fatal shark interactions globally. An adult tiger shark ranges between 10 and 14 feet in length and between 850 and 1,400 pounds. Marine researchers often regard repeated close passes by tiger sharks as a high-risk behavioral escalation. Trained professional shark divers respond by ascending slowly, maintaining body orientation toward the animal, and making no physical contact. Attempting to redirect a large shark during an active pass sequence elevates the animal's arousal and removes whatever passive window the behavior might have provided. And executing it at all requires years of supervised, species-specific experience that cannot be approximated from video. Those repeated passes are the moment where someone with proper training ascends. That is the non-negotiable response. Kieran looked at that behavior and saw an opportunity to demonstrate control. I understand the thinking, but you cannot close that experience gap by watching enough footage. As the passes grew shorter and more direct, Kieran extended his arm toward the shark during a close approach. The shark abruptly turned back across his blind side and struck, biting into his arm and torso. His dive partner's camera recorded chaotic, obscured movement before the footage became unreadable. His body was recovered later that day near the diving site with catastrophic injuries. Footage from the dive partner's camera was recovered by marine safety officials and treated as part of the formal investigation. It was not publicly released. The victim's family formally requested it remain permanently withheld, a request that has been honored. Marine safety officials identified the absence of a licensed guide, the lack of formal training, and the physical contact attempt as the primary contributing factors. The private boat operator was questioned but faced no formal charges. Kieran's dive partner gave a formal account to marine safety officials in the days that followed. From what was documented, the partner had already begun ascending before the attack escalated, which is exactly the response the situation called for. I don't say that to draw a clean contrast between the two of them. I say it because it illustrates, as clearly as any case I've come across, what the difference between trained instinct and improvised imitation actually looks like in practice. One of them ascended. One of them didn't. Kieran Holt was 31 years old. His next of kin were notified by Hawaiian authorities.